afternoon to all the listeners. Today we are going to be going through the third episode of the Procurement Chronicles. It's the first episode that we have in 2022. Our last episode was with Michael Van Kluwen at Coupa Software. Today we're lucky and grateful to have Therese Jardine with us today from Strategic Event Procurement. I'm going to ask Therese to give us a quick background on what she's doing, and then we're going to, as we always do, kind of move back to childhood and walk through your story and your life in procurement. So, Therese?
Great. Thank you for having me, and it's a privilege to be the first guest for 2022. This is going to be a much better year than our prior 2 years, I think.
Yeah.
So I like to say that I take the pain out of procurement for event organizers and agencies so that they can work in their zone of genius, which is producing really great event experiences for their attendees. And so for event organizers, this means I give consulting on strategic meetings management, which is a programmatic approach to contracting, various payment solutions, supplier relationship management, and then, of course, RFP development. For event agencies, I help them put their best foot forward with their RFP responses for their clients, and that's using the insight that I gained at Microsoft managing their event procurement strategy for close to 15 years.
Great. So we've got I'm sure we've discussed this, an interesting topic about a specific vertical within procurement that you've developed a specialization in. Well, okay, so kind of going back to the beginning. So we like to start in childhood. Some stuff's relevant, some stuff isn't, but kind of tell us your background. Where did you grow up? Any stories or kind of experiences that you feel are relevant, not necessarily just to procurement, but who you've become as a professional, the path that you think you've taken?
Oh boy. So I grew up, I was born in New York, and my mother's from the South, so we spent a brief little bit of time in the South, but basically from 5 years old on, I was growing up in rural Idaho, just outside of Boise. And my mother was a single mom, so it was definitely a hard scrabble beginning, and I learned really early on how to work hard. And I also kind of learned that hard work is important, but getting help from others is also really important in order to move forward in life. I could tell you all kinds of crazy stories. My stepfather was an over-the-road trucker, and one summer we took vacation by running loads from Idaho, where we lived, back east to Tennessee and Kentucky, where my mother was raised, so that we could visit relatives. And you've never had a road trip until you've had 2 adults and 3 kids in a 1970-something semi-truck with a little tiny sleeper.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard of a family traveling across.
I'm sure you haven't.
One of those things.
It'll probably be in my book one of these days.
That's good. That would be that's great. So I mean, your background. I mean, just kind of stepping back on what you said. You know, being raised by a single mother, at least for part of the time in rural Idaho, and the comment about getting help from others. I imagine that was probably part of how your mom and your family functioned.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah.
During more difficult times.
Yeah, our neighbor that was next door taught me how to work on my car, because he was like, I won't fix it for you, but I'll help you fix it, so that. And to this day, I can go to a mechanic's and I'm not taken advantage of, because I know my way around an engine, and and it just makes you be resourceful. And the resourcefulness, I think, is what really has carried me through my career. And my career's kind of taken a undulating path, but every role I've ever had, and even starting my own business, the ability to be tenacious and resourceful has definitely carried me through.
That's great. So, I mean, and again, key takeaways, just to summarize, learning to work hard, but also get help where needed.
Yeah.
And then being resourceful, which I always define resourceful as being able to find and identify the resources that are there when it doesn't seem like there are resources, right? I mean, if you have everything, it's not resourcefulness. It's just
Oh no, I think growing up poor was really a gift because
Yeah.
I don't take things for granted. But it did give me all those skills that I don't ever worry because I know that I've come so far from where I was to begin with, but also the things that I've learned along the way are going to keep me moving forward in a positive way.
That's great. So I actually grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, so not too far. My grandma Black was in Idaho, so we spent a lot of times in the summers going up there. Did you so from 5 on you were in Idaho? At any point did you move from Idaho before kind of entering into your education, your higher education?
I did, yes. When I graduated college, I rented a U-Haul the biggest U-Haul that my little tiny 1982 Subaru station wagon could pull. And I put whatever would fit into said U-Haul and embarked north to Seattle, where my boyfriend and his mom lived. I didn't have a job or anything, but I had about maybe $1,500 left from student loans and my last paycheck from my job. So that's where I really got my career started was in the Seattle area, which is where I am now.
Was down in Seattle. Okay, we'll jump into that in a second. I want to rewind a little bit to college though. So where did you go to college? What decision went into that? And let's kind of talk about that whole journey.
Oh gosh.
Did you major in procurement?
Yeah. So I went. I attended Boise State University. My grand goal was to go to Whitworth University here in Washington. But being a private university, that was definitely out of my reach financially, and BSU was local. And I'll date myself a little bit here, but the first semester's tuition was something like $375, and books were probably another $150. So, even back then, that was a bargain. But it was still a really high quality education. And I knew I knew I wanted to be a business major, and Boise State had just recently come out with an entrepreneurship degree, and that's what I took. And I wasn't so much thinking at that time that I would start my own business, but the entrepreneurship degree had a better rounding of finance, accounting, marketing, and human resources. Whereas, if you took any one of those, you were going to go deep into that one specific discipline. And I really wanted to learn about all of them, and that was the best way to go about doing that.
So what, stepping back a bit, why business? I mean, why was that the route you decided to go as opposed to arts or something?
Oh gosh, well, when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a vet. I'd read all of the James Herriot books, and I thought that was going to be the thing. Then when I was in high school, I got a scholarship to Idaho Business Week, so we got to go to this one happened to be at Boise State, but we got to go there for a week and learn about business and commerce and all those kinds of things. And coming from a very unprivileged background, I really felt like business and having a business degree would be the way that I would have my ticket out of kind of economic disadvantage. And I was right. It's definitely stood me in good stead over the years.
That's great. And then entrepreneurship, like you just mentioned, maybe the main driver of that is you wanted to be well-rounded within business. You didn't want to just specialize in a specific area. Right. Not necessarily we're looking to go, start the Google before Google, but just looking to understand.
Yeah, that was definitely my plan. Although it's turned out that I've had two opportunities.
Now you're an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I've had two opportunities actually to be self-employed. So
that's exciting.
It was a good choice.
So, kind of bringing it back to procurement. So while you're in college and you're going through an entrepreneurship program, what exposure did you have to procurement, to anything even remotely related to that, if any?
Almost none. In fact, I'm thinking back, when we were talking before we started recording about supply chain management, there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, you talked about warehousing and a little bit about logistics, sort of, but it wasn't really part of the business curriculum, at least what was offered
Yeah.
back when I was in school. And I think people tended to think about purchasing. I don't think I heard about procurement until I was quite a ways later in my career.
Wow. No, and that's been kind of a recurring theme to those who've listened to past episodes that, it's gotten more prevalent in universities and higher education.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the level it needs to be even now, but it's just a lack of awareness. I mean, the idea of you going to a well-known, reputable university, majoring in a well-rounded business program like entrepreneurship, and not really getting that exposure, seems like it's kind of the norm, or has been the norm until just recently.
Well, I'll date myself a little. That was in the mid-late 80s when I was attending college.
Yep. Well, I'm sure it's much. Yeah, I'm sure they've grown in that point in time since then.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned it. I do know that a lot of universities do have supply chain and procurement as a curriculum of study. Ironically, there are universities here in the U.S. that have events and event management and hospitality as a curriculum of study. And
oh wow!
So I think people tend to think of events and they immediately think, oh, party planning, wedding planning, and that's some of it. But the area that I live is in the corporate event world, and those are mega $1 million budgets with anywhere up to, if you think of CES where they have 150 to 180,000 attendees, the discipline that goes in between planning those kinds of events is really remarkable. But then the procurement that has to go along to support that has its own really tight niche, as you might imagine. And there are challenges faced in the events and meetings world that aren't typical to another category of spend.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think just the timing alone of having to bring everything into a specific, week or time period.
Well, and unlike an IT project or, some of these other things, there isn't a slip in the time schedule. If, pre-COVID.
There's no punting.
Pre-COVID times, but even then, when COVID happened, people who had planned on in-person events, had to, in the space of, in some cases, days or weeks, figure out how to produce a virtual event so that they could deliver the content that they needed to deliver. But on a typical thing, if you're supposed to, have your executive on stage for the keynote on October 1st at 9 a.m., it will happen.
Yeah.
One way or the other,
Yeah.
It will happen. And so, that the luxury of, well, if we're running short on time, we'll just bump it out a little bit. That is not in the vocabulary for events at all.
No, I think that would definitely make sense.
Yeah.
So, and let's get back to that as we kind of talk about how your expertise in procurement steered that direction. But so coming out of Boise State, you mentioned you move up to Seattle, was it?
Packed up, moved to Seattle. And,
okay. And what was that based on? It was definitely a relationship based, but what employment did you have initially in Seattle, and how did that evolve?
I didn't have employment. And prior to meeting my then boyfriend, I was looking at Seattle, Denver, Portland, a couple of the Intermountain West cities that were bigger than Boise, where I knew I would have more opportunity. Then I happened to come up to the area for a student conference, which actually was in Vancouver, BC, but we made a stop overnight in Seattle on the way, and I just really fell in love with the city. So when it happened that I met a guy who was, attending UW, University of Washington up here, that just was, extra, so to speak.
Yeah, find the city, then find the guy.
Yeah, it was by accident that it worked out, right?
It's a smart way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. But so I didn't have a job. I had about $1,500 to my name, and I had I had my degree. I was outstanding entrepreneurship graduate. I was so proud of myself, and I worked through college, and so I had some skills on my resume. And ended up going to work for a chemical distribution company as a financial analyst.
Okay.
And it's as boring as it sounds in many ways. So, I mean, the chemical industry itself, and no disrespect to the chemical industry, because it's very important really to our daily lives. But, we were in the business of, buying in bulk and then warehousing it and then packaging and shipping it out to various manufacturers. And that's kind of where I started to learn a little bit about supply chain, honestly, because on the finance end of it, you're looking at cost of goods sold and packaging and handling and all the costs that have to go into the product in order to get it ready to ship it back out into smaller quantities to various customers. And then there's trucks and forklifts and lots of warehouses and all that kind of thing. And as the financial analyst, I was responsible for putting together the annual operating budget for the company. My challenge there was I was a whopping 22 years old, I'm going to say, and I was one of the very few women, and I was almost always the youngest. So now I'll step back a little bit. When I was in college, my part-time job for most of the time I was in school was working for the Navy in the recruiting office. So again, one of only very few women, and I was definitely the youngest. But I learned how to hold my own around a bunch of guys, and they, and frankly, the Navy guys were like, it was like having a bunch of big brothers. I never had to worry about anybody picking on me at a bar or anything like that. So yeah. So I was accustomed to working in a male-dominated workplace, and that really set me up for success, at the company, because I could take a joke, but I wouldn't take it if it went too far. And and I also had the internal confidence to be able to tell somebody if they were taking it a little too far. And so it really, I was able to build respect amongst my peers and the people that were more senior to me. And what I learned was kryptonite for almost any middle manager is you mention the word budget to them. They just would go into a panic. And so my approach was I was going to teach them how to do it and take the fear out of it for them. And it was kind of I guess, I don't want to say the word honor, but they nicknamed me the budget goddess after.
That's an honor. I like that.
So they're like, oh, you got a problem? Go see the budget goddess. And they would send them my way, and I'd help them figure out how to forecast, what their expenses and revenue was going to look like for the next year. And then I had to compile all of that into, because we had, 100 and some warehouses, 15 or 20 area offices, 3 or 4 regional offices, and then all that had to get rolled up to corporate, along with all the procurement or the support departments like human resources and accounting and finance and all the corporate support office. Each one of those departments had their own budget, so I had to get that all put together and up in front of senior management so that they could approve it and send it to the board and all that good stuff. And the really important part about that was it gave me systems development experience, because the first year that I was working there, we were using not even Excel, it was Lotus. And it wasn't Lotus Notes, it was just Lotus 123 on DOS. Remember, this is like 1988, 89, right? And so we were having to manually combine all these files. And I went to my boss and I said, this is crazy. We're a, multi-million-dollar company. This is not a way to do our budget. He says, okay, go see Lori in IT. She'll set you up with a consultant. We'll build a program. And I was like, okay. So I got to design and build the program and roll it out and train people on it. And, that ended up being kind of the theme for my career for the next 15 years. And frankly, it's how I ended up at Microsoft.
Okay. So that in that financial analyst role, how long were you with that chemicals organization? Was that?
So I worked for them for about 8 years. and ended up getting transferred with my now ex-husband to New Jersey because he was actually tapped to be the operations manager for the area warehouse operations. So he was the financial manager for all of that. They found a role for me selling third-party product handling. So this is another place where I really learned about supply chain because we had some excess capacity with transportation and with our warehousing and material packaging. And then there were other organizations who needed some extra capacity in that regard. So I would go around and sell our services to these other organizations, and and that way we were able to kind of maximize our capacity and keep the profit margins up. That was not the most glamorous product to sell, but it's what I did for a little while, and then that company had a reorganization, and they ended up disbanding that particular line of business because it sounded better on paper than it actually was. Because a lot of times the capacity that we were selling, the customers that needed it at the exact same time as our peak times. And so it was supposed to kind of fill in the valleys, and it ended up being kind of a competition for the peak time of capacity. And so, we ended up not doing that. And I ended up leaving and going to work for a small radio broadcasting company in New York City.
Oh, wow. So we'll go from New Jersey to New York.
I stayed in New Jersey, but I just rode the train in every day. And again, I was hired to help them implement a broadcast management system. Because the company I worked for, it was an interesting business model. They provided, I don't know if they're still in business, content to radio stations in exchange for advertising time. So if you've ever been driving to work or driving home from work, and they'll have a little comedy clip that would come on, for instance, most likely that was syndicated content that would come from the company I was at, and it's basically it fills their airtime so the DJs don't have to do so much work. And we had like musicians doing kind of back in it wasn't called a podcast then, but it was similar where you'd have a host and he'd bring in a different musician each week to talk about what was going on in whatever genre of music it was. It was really an interesting thing, and so I had to help them implement the system that managed the advertising time that we were putting out into the marketplace.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So you go from financial analyst to basically systems implementation expert, and that leads you up eventually to Microsoft.
Yeah.
Is that your initial role at Microsoft? Was that also based on systems implementation?
It was for their procurement reporting system. So
okay, this is where
we make the jump. Yes, I could tell you were probably going, where the heck does this go?
This is always fun because honestly, this is more normal than you'd think. This is kind of, it's like at what point did you become a procurement person? And it's really kind of hard to figure out in a lot of people's careers because
and I told you it's a very undulating path. So when we moved back to Seattle, I had actually gone after I left the broadcasting company. I worked for another financial system company, but I was implementing financial systems for them. That's what they did. And then I ended up consulting for them after I had my second kid. They wanted me to travel all over, and I couldn't. And so I said, listen, I'll just fill in when you need me. We moved to Seattle, and then 9/11 happened.
Oh, wow.
And, being a consultant is kind of fun. In fact, that's what I do now. But, when you have two little kids at home, the concept of being trapped in Houston and no way home for a week and a half was not really something that my family was willing to face. I wasn't so worried about being on the doomed plane as I was about, being caught someplace where I just wouldn't be able to get home.
It's stuck.
And so I thought, well, maybe it's time to go back to, a full-time position again. And I had some connections that I knew from my time at the chemical company who had gone to work for Accenture and then landed at Microsoft. So I reached out to a couple of them, and the one guy, Mike Huber, he was the chief procurement officer at Microsoft, and he was working with the IT team to get this procurement system put in place. And so he put my resume in front of him, and that's how I ended up at Microsoft. And then about 3 years later, my key stakeholder on the project was in procurement, and he had an event category manager job open up. And so I threw my hat in the ring, and I got it, and I have been in procurement ever since.
And an event category.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. So, and what was that like? I mean, Microsoft is a great example of a company that would have some pretty complex, large events to.
Oh, yeah.
I would imagine. Yeah. So, I mean, as you stepped into that, I mean, because as you stepped into that wasn't something you'd had experience with in the past. What you kind of alluded to this earlier, but what were some of the unique things that you didn't expect and you'd have to deal with?
Well, the first thing I didn't expect was my predecessor in the position was actually a lawyer, and
okay,
all but 2 of our master service agreements were expired.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, wow, you would think that that's the one thing the lawyer would keep up on, and it wasn't, So the first year I basically spent, my time rewriting master agreements and looking at rate cards and understanding what they meant. And then I really joined hips with the event marketing team and got kind of just pulled into their sphere, if you will, to just learn about what all goes into some of these big events. And Microsoft had, and they still do, have probably 5 or 6, maybe 8, what you'd call a flagship event, which would be, at least 5,000 people, and in some cases up to 40,000 people. And so you've got hotel rooms and, food and production and planning. I mean, the planning cycle on some of these events is a year long. I mean, you finish the one, everybody takes a week's vacation and a deep breath, and then they start planning, almost immediately for the next year's event. So, the number of suppliers and resources that go into that is astonishing. I mean, it can be over 100 suppliers.
Yeah. I've gone to conferences just, like having a booth.
Yeah.
And it seems like you have to have a dozen just to be able to, someone to set up the electrical. But I mean, the idea of putting on an event that has 40,000 participants and, over multiple days has got to be, yeah.
Yeah, and the contracting that goes into that is pretty remarkable. And one of the things that I really focused on and specialized in was the room block contracting with the hotels. Because, that's thousands and thousands of room nights for a hotel that you've got to secure.
Yeah.
And the big challenge that we had with events is, if you think about consulting or, professional services, you can hire your Accentures or your McKinseys or, maybe a local provider, and, you set them up as a supplier one time, and, in most cases they're a national presence, and so if you need somebody in North Carolina, then you're still working with Accenture. It's just they're going to send somebody to North Carolina for you. Well, with events, you have to work with the suppliers on location, because you can't send a catering company from Seattle to Atlanta. You can't send all the security staff that you need, from Seattle to Atlanta. You have to buy the services. Many of the services you have to buy locally. And so sometimes that means you have to set up brand new supplier records for, at least some contingent, maybe, at least 10% of the supply base is somebody that's brand new to you that you've never worked with before.
Yeah.
So that makes you got to find them, you got to negotiate with them, you got to get them under contract, and then you got to get them through the arduous process of having them set up as a supplier so that they can get paid. And that was really one of the number one challenges that we had, in particular with hotels. And hotels don't want to have to go in to, an invoicing system and figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, they're only going to do it one time. So,
Yeah, especially if you're not going to use them year in, year out.
right, exactly. And
Yeah.
so, or we would use them and then we wouldn't go back for,
A couple of years.
couple years, and by then, AP is doing a purge, and so they've been purged out of the system, and you got to start all over again. It's like Sisyphus pushing a rock up a hill. So one of the programs I put in place right away was a meeting card program, so that people could. Well, and it's also called strategic meeting management. So one of the things I found was when you have a company the size of Microsoft, people are doing events all over the place and they don't necessarily know about each other. And I actually ended up with 2 requests on my desk, both of them marked urgent, for the same hotel in Las Vegas. And I'm like, huh. So I call the first person and I said, what's going on? He says, oh my God, there's another high-tech client interested in this space. We have to act fast. I said, yeah, give me a minute. So I called the other guy and I said, so what's going on here? And he says, oh my gosh, we have to go fast. There's another high-tech client interested in this space. And I said, oh dear, I know what's happening here. So I connected the 2 of them and I said, gentlemen, you are the other high-tech client. And I'll give the hotel a little grace. They were working with different sales managers at the hotel, but, and they both looked at each other and me and said, how did this happen? And I was like, yeah, I know. How did this happen? So I implemented a sourcing program for hotels so that we actually hired an agency that's an expert in hotel negotiating. And they took our, helped us build a contract template. They would send out the RFPs to the hotels and come back to the event organizers and the marketing managers and say, okay, if you want to be in Boston on these days, these are 5 options for you, which one works best. And then once they chose the one that worked best, then the sourcing team would go back and negotiate and, get the thing under contract, so that the marketing people, all they had to worry about was, hiring their planning agency and getting going again. And then along with that, we had the meeting card program so that you could quickly contract and quickly pay, and that was a huge success.
Nice. Yeah, kind of full circle back into making sure that you're getting help from other people, right?
Yeah.
With the shower, right? I mean, bringing in the right people could free up the resources that they should be doing.
And with strategic meeting management, the ROI, I ended up with a 900% ROI.
Oh, wow.
So for every dollar we spent, on the staff that was doing the sourcing and the software license that we needed to do it, for every dollar we spent, we saved $9. And that doesn't count the wear and tear on the humans, because the marketing managers weren't going online and looking to see what hotels might be in an area and then making 100 phone calls. They just filled out what they needed. It went over to to the team. They took care of it and went from there. I mean, it's not to say we didn't have some snafus here and there, but it was definitely and it's still in place. So it's been a very successful program, and that's really what I'm doing now, offering out now to corporate clients is for smaller companies who don't have maybe a full-on procurement resource, or maybe they have a procurement department but they don't have the event expertise. I can go in and give them that, the experience. And I like to tell people I've tripped over the rocks and I've stepped on the rake, so I've seen almost anything you can imagine, and I can help you not do that.
So how long? Yeah, kind of jumping into what your new entrepreneurial venture. How long were you at Microsoft before kind of deciding to kind of start your own thing, and what was the main driver for that?
Yeah, so I was at Microsoft for just shy of 18 years, and
wow.
Toward the end, I was kind of feeling like I had slain the dragons that I could slay, and was kind of thinking about making a change. And to my advantage, Microsoft does a reorganization every year, and they kind of also recognized that I had sort of worked myself out of a job, and so I got a package to leave, which I have called always the gift of independence.
That's amazing, yeah.
And after I did that, I took some time to rest because hadn't realized the pace that I was running at for a very long time. And when I got to thinking about what I wanted to do next, that's when I said, I really like what I do. The big companies already have somebody like me. And the small companies can't afford somebody like me full time. So why not be a fractional procurement expert for, and then also on the other side, working with suppliers all those years at Microsoft, they just struggled. And, and I would help them along, but, in fact, the bulk of my clientele so far has been suppliers trying to figure out procurement. Because, January 2020 is when I started my business, and I was off to a great start, and then COVID hit.
Great timing.
Oh.
Perfect time to start a new business.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's a good thing I didn't know, because I may or may not have dove in. So it's good that I didn't, because I did, and I'm glad for it. So, but now that corporations are starting to look at having events again and in person, I think a lot of them realized when all those cancellations happened that they had contracts they hadn't even heard of, and they were not on, they were all on what we call hotel paper, so it was the supplier's contract, not the company's. And so some poor attorney or bank of attorneys had to look at every single contract individually to see what the force majeure clause said and what the cancellation, clauses looked like. And it was brutal. And so nobody wants to repeat that again. And that's kind of where I come in, because I can give them a kind of a quick ramp, with the project plan, because since I've done it, I've already got the project plan in place. I can take their data, look at it, see how much savings opportunity that they have and where their risk is, and get a project plan put together and RFP put out the door with very little time lapsed.
Nice. So what I kind of, with working with smaller companies, providing your expertise after coming out from Microsoft, what size companies are you looking at, and what types of events? I mean, and realizing that you're coming out of 2020 and 2021, what type of events are common? Like what are the kind of the common things that you're doing for your clients?
Nothing's common right now. The target organizations are kind of the fast-growing software companies, because I know the general style of how those events go. I also know the culture, which is kind of, for a while let's run around and let's be cowboys, and then it's like, oh, that's not so good. And so I'm wanting to catch them at the time. I'd like to catch them before they totally go cowboy, because then it's less retraining you have to do. But I was just actually talking to an agency yesterday who does the planning for software companies, and I was like, you and I, and they had reached out to me about help with an RFP, and we kind of started talking about we could probably collaborate, because they do the production, I can help with the taining all of the smaller events that run around, and so the two of us can probably get some synergies and help the clients out quite a bit. But again, the suppliers, that's been my bread and butter, because, now every RFP that they get is that much more important. They've got to keep their book of business up in order to cover their overhead. And somebody like me who's read hundreds, if not thousands, of RFP responses, I can look at theirs and read through it and say, all right, you've made 3 of the top 5 mistakes that I've seen. The most egregious, and I tell people this, if you're going to use boilerplate content as your starting point, you have to be very careful, because I actually have seen, at XYZ company, we work really hard to make sure that insert client name here, events run seamlessly. I mean, they left the insert client name here in the proposal. So that's an ouch. And answering the question, you got to answer the question where they ask it. Don't refer to slide 10, because I mean,
Yeah.
you said you were talking to the gentleman from, was it Coupa last week?
Yeah,
The
last month.
The last
Yep.
episode. Well,
Yeah, episode 2.
software programs like Coupa and Ariba, all of the suppliers put their answers in, and then the person who's reviewing is looking at a screen with all 4 or 5 respondents next to each other. And so if somebody
Exactly.
sends you off to look at Exhibit B, page 1, you have to leave where you are to go do that. And then you got to go find where you,
Yep.
I mean, I had this happen to me personally, and I was like, man, you just got a 0 on that answer because you're making me work to go find what you were supposed to tell me, So that's,
Yeah.
that's insight that I give to the suppliers. And, and I give them consulting on, what their payment milestones should look like, especially with COVID, and I had one of my clients called me last night and, there's an event coming up and she's like, I really want to work it, but I know that this particular client has, they have a cancellation at will clause in their master service agreement. And she's like, if we take it, we're going to have to turn away work. And I was like, well, then you're going to need to put, it's either some stronger milestones for your payment or non-refundable deposits, or, if you cancel at this point, then this much of the fee is preserved. Because, some of these events, they're planning on being in person, and then if Omicron really kicks up or another one worse than Delta comes along, it's going to cancel. And you don't want to have, especially a small company, and a lot of event suppliers tend to be a little on the smaller side. If you've turned away business to take this business, you can't go back and get that other business. It's just gone. And it's not like you have inventory where you can just sell those services tomorrow. Because once today is gone, you don't have those hours back.
Yeah, I mean, I think your timing for that's key, and I think the risk that would be on the supplier side in this environment is, right. I mean, it's impossible to know where we're going to be in 30 days.
Yeah, exactly, and and that's just what I'd advise them is you have to tell your clients that you can't bear the risk for the decision that they're going to make, so you really got to protect.
Yeah.
You got to protect yourself, and and I think in that case, most procurement people are understanding of that. I mean, they don't want to be. they want to. They want to protect the company at all costs. But there comes a point where people will just say no, and they won't be able to afford to take the risk.
Yeah. Eventually, they'll go out of business if they. I mean, I remember I was going to 3 or 4 different conferences when February of 2020 hit, and initially they were trying everything. They go, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then obviously we all know how that happened, but but it's still an issue. I mean, we're in my household just going through our COVID run right now, so for the first time,
I've avoided it so far, and I was even in Las Vegas about a week and a half ago, and I made it in and out of there without it. So,
wow. You might be bulletproof then, because that's at this point in time, it's gotten a little common. But I mean, we're getting close to the end of time. But what are some? I think that's a great kind of summary of what got you to where you're at and what you're currently doing. What do you wish you would have known? I mean, so coming out of college, or I guess you didn't start off as a procurement professional, and I think most people don't. But if you were talking to someone coming out of college as a procurement professional, looking into the field, what are some of the lessons that you've gotten over your career that you think that they should have at the beginning of their career?
Ooh. Well, first thing, if I was talking to a college student, I would tell them to make sure they make some time to have some fun. I worked so hard going through school, and the first probably 10, 15 years of my career that, there just wasn't as much fun as there could have been. So make time for that, I will say.
Yeah.
If you're going to work in procurement, you have to understand that a lot of times people look at procurement as a pain in the butt, that they're making you do something.
Yeah.
And so knowing that, you really want to make sure you build a relationship with your stakeholders and really take the time to learn and understand their business, especially if you're in a category like events or, some of these other things that have really unique factors that affect how people buy or how they actually use the services that they're getting. Take the time to really understand, go shadow them for a day. For me, one of the best things somebody ever did to me was take me to a couple of the great big events so that I could see firsthand how much food it took to feed all those people, and just the sheer labor effort of getting everything onto the trade show floor, getting all the lights set up for the keynote, all that kind of stuff. Once you see it in action and it's no longer just a number, it starts making a lot more sense. And then you'll also get street cred with your stakeholders if you do that. So you gotta learn their business, and you gotta listen. Learn it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. An analogy I've used in a similar type of a point is just the idea that if you go to a doctor and they don't listen to your symptoms before they prescribe something to you, I mean, why are you going to listen to that doctor, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you want someone that's going to, and I think being able to reach out to stakeholders, understand they're like you say, how much food's going on. I mean, really seeing what's going on before you're coming in and being, the procurement individual that kind of, sets things up. They understand you're coming from a place of knowledge.
And just kind of, demonstrating the value that you can bring them. And sometimes it's saving their behinds. There were a few times when someone was about to make a giant mistake that would have ended up being a policy violation for the company, and I was able to kind of pull them aside and say, hold on, you don't want to do that, and here's why. And first they were kind of skeptical, and then I kind of showed them, and they were like, I think you just saved my job. And I said, I think maybe I just did.
That's good. Be an ally. I like that. Okay. Well, that's super helpful. I don't want to use more of your time than we've kind of set off, but really do appreciate your time today, Therese. Anything else you wanted to kind of, put out there? I'll make sure we link your LinkedIn account when we post this. But if someone was looking, especially with some of the individuals I'm talking to are in industry as opposed to being an entrepreneur and running their own business. But if someone wanted to get in contact with you, other than kind of reaching out on LinkedIn, what's the best method to do that?
Oh, they could send me an email, and you could put this in the show notes. But it's Therese at strategiceventprocurement.com. I tried really hard to get a longer URL, and I just couldn't do it. So.
Just like a small novel in the URL. I like it. Yeah. Great. Awesome. So I'll make sure to put that in the show notes below. If anyone reaches out to me, with anything else, I'll send them your direction, and appreciate your time on this late Friday. And hope you have a great
my
weekend.
Pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Therese.